The world did not end with a single explosion. It did not collapse under the weight of one catastrophic moment. Instead, it bled out slowly, like a wound no one noticed until the body had already gone cold. Cities that once pulsed with millions of lives fell silent over the span of weeks. Traffic lights still flickered above intersections where no cars moved. Emergency broadcasts looped endlessly through static, repeating instructions that no one was left to follow. The infrastructure of civilization crumbled not because it was destroyed, but because the people who maintained it were either dead or no longer human. The infection spread faster than any government could respond to. Hospitals became slaughterhouses. Military checkpoints became graveyards. And the dead, the ones who should have stayed still and silent, stood back up with hollow eyes and an endless hunger that knew no reason, no mercy, and no end. Within 60 days, the world as anyone had known it was functionally gone. What remained was a rotting stage, where the old rules no longer applied and survival had become the only currency that mattered. On the outskirts of a nameless city somewhere along the eastern seaboard, a man in a dark tactical suit moved through the wreckage of a collapsed overpass. His boots made no sound against the shattered concrete. His eyes, hidden behind a cowl that had once struck fear into the hearts of Gotham's criminal underworld, now scanned the ruins not for criminals but for something far more disturbing. Bruce Wayne had arrived in this world not by choice but by circumstance. The biological anomaly that reanimated dead tissue had caught his attention weeks before the official collapse. He had been investigating it as a pathogen, tracking its mutation patterns through stolen CDC data and intercepted military communications. When Gotham fell, he did not mourn. He adapted. He packed what he could carry, abandoned the cave, and moved toward the origin point of the outbreak because that was what he did. He solved problems. And this was the largest problem humanity had ever faced. Miles away in the burned shell of a highway rest stop, another man sat in silence. A pistol rested on the table in front of him. His suit was torn. His knuckles were split. Around him lay the bodies of 7 walkers, each dispatched with a precision that bordered on mechanical. John Wick had not been investigating anything when the world ended. He had been grieving. The quiet life he had tried to rebuild for the second time had been swallowed by the same chaos that consumed everything else. He woke one morning to the sound of screaming, and by noon he had killed more things than he could count. He did not understand the infection. He did not care to. What he understood was threat and response. The dead came for him, and he put them down. It was simple. It was clean. And it was the only thing left in the world that made sense to him. Their paths converged 3 nights later on the outskirts of the city. A swarm of walkers, hundreds deep, had been drawn by the sound of a collapsing building. Bruce had been using the structure as a vantage point to map the herd's movement patterns. When the floor gave way beneath him, he found himself on the street, surrounded on all sides by the dead. He fought his way through the first wave with calculated strikes, using a steel baton to crush skulls and create distance. But the numbers were overwhelming, even for him. Then the gunfire started. From the far end of the street, precise shots began dropping walkers one after another. Each bullet found its mark. Each body crumpled without a wasted round. Bruce turned to see a man walking calmly through the horde, firing with a rhythm that resembled breathing more than combat. Within minutes, the swarm was broken. The dead littered the pavement like fallen leaves. The 2 men stood across from each other in the silence that followed. Neither spoke immediately. Bruce studied the stranger's posture, his efficiency, the way he reloaded without looking down. John studied the cowled figure's bruised but unbroken stance, the gadgets on his belt, the controlled breathing of someone trained far beyond ordinary limits. They were not alike. Their methods were not the same. Their reasons for surviving could not have been more different. But in that moment, standing among the fallen dead beneath a sky choked with ash, both men recognized the same thing in each other. A killer's calm, a survivor's will. And that recognition, unspoken and absolute, was enough. They did not trust each other. Trust was a luxury that belonged to the old world, to boardrooms and handshakes and promises made under fluorescent lights. In this world, trust was earned through action, and so far all they had were observations. Bruce observed that John moved like a weapon given human form. Every step was deliberate. Every gesture was efficient. There was no wasted motion in anything he did, from the way he cleared a room to the way he ate cold rations in the dark. John observed that Bruce never slept deeply. He planned constantly. He drew maps on scraps of paper, calculated distances, tracked walker migration patterns using methods that belonged in a war room rather than a collapsed highway. Their first days together were defined by contrast. When they encountered a cluster of walkers inside an abandoned department store, Bruce signaled for silence. He moved along the ceiling beams, using a grapple line to position himself above the horde. One by one, he dropped behind isolated walkers, dispatching them with quiet precision before they could alert the rest. It took 12 minutes. Not a single sound echoed through the building. John watched from the entrance and said nothing. The next encounter was different. A group of walkers stumbled upon their camp at dawn. Before Bruce could assess the situation, John was already moving. He fired 4 rounds in under 2 seconds, each one a kill shot. Then he holstered the weapon, picked up a blade, and cut through the remaining 3 with movements so fluid they looked choreographed. It took 9 seconds. Bruce watched and said nothing. Their philosophies revealed themselves through these moments. Batman believed survival meant preservation. Every bullet spent was a bullet lost. Every unnecessary confrontation was energy wasted. The apocalypse was a long game, and he intended to play it with patience. Wick believed survival meant dominance. Hesitation created vulnerability. Speed and lethality were not luxuries but necessities. The apocalypse rewarded those who acted first and questioned later. Yet despite these differences, something remarkable happened when they operated together. Bruce would scout ahead, mapping threats and identifying safe corridors through walker territory. John would handle any breach in the plan with immediate lethal response. Bruce provided the mind, John provided the edge. And together they moved through the ruins of the eastern seaboard with a fluidity that no single survivor could have achieved alone. They cleared a hospital in under an hour, recovering antibiotics, surgical tools, and enough preserved food to last 2 weeks. Bruce disabled the building's fire alarm system before entry to prevent noise triggers. John swept each floor with methodical aggression, never allowing a single walker to close within arm's reach before it was neutralized. They moved like 2 parts of the same machine, one calculating and the other executing, and the result was a kind of terrifying efficiency that the apocalypse had never seen before. But walkers were predictable. They followed sound. They followed movement. They operated on instinct alone, and instinct could be outsmarted or outfought. The real danger, the one Bruce had been quietly preparing for since the first night, was not the dead. It was the living. He had seen the signs. Graffiti marking territory. Tripwires strung across alleyways. Shell casings from weapons too organized to belong to panicked civilians. Someone out there was not just surviving. Someone was organizing. And organized survivors in a lawless world meant one of 2 things. Either a community trying to rebuild or a predator learning to hunt with human intelligence. Bruce shared his theory with John over a cold fire that night. John listened without expression. When Bruce finished explaining his concerns about organized human threats, John simply checked his ammunition count and said 5 words. "Then we kill them too." Bruce stared at him for a long moment. In that silence, the fault line between them became visible for the first time. Not a crack, not yet, but a tremor. A quiet warning that these 2 men, forged in entirely different furnaces of pain, might one day find themselves standing on opposite sides of a line that neither could cross. But that night the line held, and together they moved on. The first sign of the ambush was a tin can rolling across broken pavement. It was too deliberate to be wind, too precise to be an animal. Bruce caught it immediately, his hand rising in a fist to signal a halt. John had already stopped. He had heard it too. Not the can itself, but the almost imperceptible shift of weight on gravel 30 meters to the east. Someone was watching them. They had entered the remnants of a small town south of the highway. Storefronts with shattered windows lined the main street. A church steeple leaned at a broken angle against a gray sky. It looked abandoned. It was not. The first shot came from a rooftop. It missed John by inches and buried itself in a brick wall behind him. Before the echo faded, John had identified the shooter's position, drawn his weapon, and returned fire with 2 rounds that silenced the rooftop permanently. Bruce moved in the opposite direction, vanishing into shadow with a speed that defied his size. 6 attackers revealed themselves. Armed with hunting rifles and crude melee weapons, they emerged from doorways and alleys with the confidence of people who had done this before. They were not walkers. They were not desperate refugees. They were predators. Humans who had discovered that in a world without law, the fastest path to survival was taking from others. John engaged 3 of them head-on. The first swung a machete that never completed its arc. John redirected the man's arm, broke it at the elbow, and used the momentum to drive him into the second attacker. The third raised a shotgun, but John was already inside the weapon's effective range. He disarmed the man in one motion and dropped him with a strike to the throat that ended the fight before it truly began. Bruce handled the remaining 3 without killing a single one. He emerged from the darkness behind them, disabling the first with a nerve strike that collapsed the man's legs. The second received a baton to the wrist that shattered bone and sent a rifle clattering to the ground. The third, the youngest of the group, turned to run. Bruce let him go. John looked at Bruce with an expression that carried more weight than any words could. He did not understand mercy in this context. In his experience, mercy was a delayed death sentence. Every enemy left alive was a future threat. Every act of compassion was a gamble that the apocalypse did not reward. Bruce met his gaze and held it. He did not explain himself. He did not justify the choice. He simply began searching the unconscious attackers for supplies and information. In one of their pockets, he found a hand-drawn map marking 3 other ambush sites along the highway. These people were organized. They had a system, and systems meant leadership. John reloaded his weapon and stood over the man whose arm he had broken. The man groaned on the ground, clutching his twisted limb, and looked up at John with pure terror in his eyes. John stared down at him for a long moment, then turned and walked away, not out of mercy, out of indifference. The man was no longer a threat and therefore no longer relevant. That night they camped in the church. Bruce sat in a pew and studied the map under a dim flashlight. John cleaned his weapons at the altar. Neither spoke for nearly an hour. The silence between them had changed. It was no longer the comfortable quiet of 2 professionals operating in sync. It was heavier, charged with a question that neither wanted to ask out loud. What happens when they disagree about something that matters? Bruce believed the ambush proved that humanity's greatest enemy had never been the dead. It was the willingness of the living to abandon everything that made them human. He believed that saving civilization meant holding on to principles even when the world no longer demanded them. John believed the ambush proved the opposite. Principles were anchors in a flood. They dragged you under. The only moral code that mattered now was the one that kept you breathing. Both men were right, and that was the problem. They saw it from 3 miles out. A skyline of shattered towers rising against a pale morning sky like the ribcage of something enormous that had died standing up. The city had no name anymore. Whatever it had been called before the outbreak was irrelevant. Now it was simply a territory. A vast urban graveyard where the dead moved in herds so large they resembled rivers flowing through concrete canyons. From their elevated position on a highway overpass, Bruce counted the walkers through a pair of modified binoculars. His estimate was conservative but staggering. Tens of thousands filled the streets below, shuffling in slow, endless circles like a tide that never receded. John studied the scene with a different kind of calculation. He was not counting bodies. He was counting exits, entry points, choke point, the distance between cover positions. His mind did not process the city as a horror. It processed it as a geometry problem with teeth. Bruce unfolded a city map he had recovered from a gas station 2 days earlier and began plotting a route. He identified sewer systems that ran beneath the main streets, elevated walkways between buildings, and structural weak points that could be used to redirect herds with controlled noise. His plan was to move through the city like water through cracks, never confronting the dead directly, never allowing themselves to be seen or heard or smelled. John agreed to the plan, not because he admired its elegance, but because ammunition was finite and he had counted every round he carried. 47 pistol rounds, 12 rifle rounds, 1 fragmentation device Bruce had constructed from salvage materials. Against tens of thousands of walkers, those numbers meant nothing in a direct fight. Stealth was not preference. It was mathematics. They entered the city through a drainage tunnel on the southern edge. The darkness inside was absolute. Bruce activated a low-frequency sonar device built into his cowl that mapped the tunnel ahead in pulses invisible to the dead. John moved behind him, one hand on the wall, the other resting on his holstered weapon. They traveled in silence for over an hour, the only sound the distant echo of groaning that filtered through the concrete above them like the murmur of a restless ocean. When they emerged into the city itself, the scale of death became overwhelming. Cars sat in permanent gridlock, their windows smeared with dried blood. Bodies that had not reanimated lay in doorways, too decomposed to rise, their remains a testament to the speed of the original collapse. And between the buildings the walkers moved, slowly, endlessly. Their collective sound was not a roar but a whisper. Thousands of dragging feet and low moans blending into a single ambient frequency that vibrated in the chest like a second heartbeat. Bruce navigated them through elevated walkways that connected office buildings above street level. His grapple line carried them across gaps where the walkways had collapsed. John moved with the same silence, his body instinctively adapting to each new surface, each new angle. When a walker appeared unexpectedly in a stairwell, John dispatched it with a blade before it could vocalize. When a structural beam groaned under their weight, threatening to alert the herd below, Bruce redistributed their load across secondary supports with an engineer's intuition. They reached the city center by nightfall. And there, from the top floor of a crumbling financial tower, they saw something that changed the nature of their journey entirely. Not fire, not sunlight reflected off glass. Electric lights, steady and deliberate, glowing from a compound built into the remains of a sports stadium on the city's western edge. Walls had been constructed from vehicles and debris. Guard towers rose at each corner, and inside those walls people moved, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Bruce studied the compound through his binoculars for a long time. He saw the guard rotations. He saw the weapons. He saw the way certain people moved freely, while others moved with the hunched posture of those who had no freedom at all. Some carried heavy loads under the watch of armed figures. Others sat in clusters behind chain-link fencing, separated from the rest like livestock. This was not a sanctuary. It was a kingdom, built on the backs of the weak by those strong enough to hold a gun and cruel enough to use it. John saw it too. His expression did not change. He had seen places like this before, in other lives and other wars. Power vacuums always produced the same result. Someone filled them, and the someone who filled them was rarely kind. Bruce lowered the binoculars and turned to John. His jaw was set. His eyes carried something John had not seen in them before. Not anger, conviction. Whatever they had been doing before, whatever aimless survival had defined their journey until now, it was over. This city had a problem, and Bruce Wayne had never been able to walk away from a problem. Bruce spent 2 days observing the compound before he spoke. He watched the guard shifts. He mapped the wall's structural weaknesses. He counted the armed soldiers and estimated their training level based on movement patterns and weapon handling. He listened to radio chatter intercepted through a device he had assembled from salvaged electronics. And when he had seen enough, he sat down across from John in their makeshift observation post and laid out what he had found. The compound was controlled by a man who called himself Mercer, former military, possibly special forces based on the discipline of his inner circle. Mercer had seized the stadium within the first weeks of the outbreak and had spent the months since expanding his control over surrounding blocks. Survivors who wandered into his territory were given a choice: serve or be cast outside the walls into the herd. Those who served worked. They scavenged. They built. They maintained the walls and the generators and the water filtration systems. In return, they were given food and protection. But the exchange was not equal. Mercer's soldiers ate well. The workers did not. Mercer's people carried weapons. The workers were forbidden from touching them. And those who resisted, those who spoke against the order of things, disappeared. Bruce explained all of this with the calm precision of someone presenting evidence in a courtroom. He believed intervention was not optional. It was necessary. If they left this place untouched, Mercer's operation would grow. It would consume more survivors. It would become a machine that fed on human suffering and called it civilization. John listened without interrupting. When Bruce finished, John asked a single question. What does this have to do with us? Bruce did not answer immediately. He understood the question was not callous. It was practical. John Wick was not a hero. He had never claimed to be. He was a man who had lost everything and survived out of reflex more than purpose. Asking him to fight someone else's war was asking him to care about something beyond his own continuation. And caring, in John's experience, was the first step toward losing something again. Bruce chose not to argue. Instead, he waited. The answer came the following morning. At dawn, Mercer's soldiers dragged 3 people outside the compound walls. 2 men and a woman. Their hands were bound. Their faces were swollen from beatings. A soldier read something from a piece of paper, though the words were too distant to hear. Then, one by one, the soldiers executed them, shot each one in the head, and left their bodies at the base of the wall as a message to anyone inside who might consider defiance. John watched through the scope of his rifle. His finger rested beside the trigger. Not on it, beside it. For a long time he did not move. Then he lowered the rifle, looked at Bruce, and said 2 words. "Show me." Bruce laid out the plan that night. Phase 1 was disruption. Using salvage materials, Bruce had constructed 3 noise devices designed to emit high-frequency pulses at timed intervals. These would be placed at strategic points around the compound's eastern wall, drawing sections of the nearby Walker herd toward the perimeter. The herd would force Mercer's soldiers to redistribute, thinning the guard presence on the western and northern walls. Phase 2 was infiltration. While the eastern wall was under siege from the dead, Bruce and John would enter from the northwest, through a drainage pipe that fed into the stadium's lower levels. Bruce had identified this entry point from the compound's original architectural plans, which he had found in a city planning office 2 blocks away. Phase 3 was decapitation. John would move through the interior toward Mercer's command center while Bruce disabled the compound's communication array and power supply. Without coordination, Mercer's soldiers would be unable to mount an organized response. Without power, the floodlights that kept the walkers at bay along the eastern wall would go dark, increasing the pressure from the herd and creating further chaos. They moved at midnight, the noise devices activated on schedule. Within minutes, the eastern wall was swarmed. Gunfire erupted as Mercer's soldiers scrambled to reinforce the position. In the confusion, Bruce and John slipped through the drainage pipe and emerged inside the stadium's maintenance tunnels. Bruce moved through the infrastructure like a ghost, severing communication lines, disabling backup generators, and locking blast doors that isolated entire sections of the compound. Soldiers found themselves trapped in corridors with no radio contact and no light. John moved upward, through stairwells and hallways, past guards who never heard him coming. His pistol fired only when necessary. His blade did the rest. Each encounter lasted seconds. Each ended the same way. By the time he reached Mercer's command room, 12 soldiers had fallen, and not one had managed to raise an alarm. Mercer was standing behind a desk when John entered. He was holding a radio that no longer worked, staring at it as though willpower alone might restore the signal. He looked up at John with the expression of a man who had built a throne and was watching it dissolve beneath him. John did not speak. He did not need to. The look on his face carried a message older than language. Your kingdom is over. The compound fell before sunrise. Not a single enslaved survivor was harmed in the operation. Bruce had made sure of that. Every phase of the plan had been designed around one principle that John found impractical but could not deny was effective. Protect the innocent, dismantle the guilty, and by the time the sun broke over the walls of the stadium, both had been accomplished. The days that followed the fall of Mercer's compound were unlike anything the survivors had experienced since the outbreak began. For weeks they had lived under the constant weight of obedience. They had eaten when told, worked when ordered, and slept in shifts dictated by soldiers who viewed them as tools rather than people. Now those soldiers were gone. The walls still stood. The generator still hummed, restored by Bruce within hours of the assault. But the atmosphere inside had changed in a way that no infrastructure could account for. The air itself felt different, not safer, not yet, but open, as though a door that had been sealed for months had finally been pushed ajar and the faintest breath of something almost forgotten had drifted through. Bruce took it upon himself to organize what remained. He did not assume leadership. He understood that people who had just escaped one form of control would not welcome another. Instead, he offered knowledge. He showed them how to reinforce the walls using structural principles that distributed weight more evenly. He taught small groups how to purify water using filtration methods that required nothing more than sand, charcoal, and fabric. He helped them establish a rationing system that ensured every person received equal portions, regardless of their role within the community. His methods were quiet and patient and rooted in the belief that civilization was not a place or a government but a set of choices made daily by ordinary people. The survivors responded slowly. Trust does not rebuild overnight, especially among people who have been betrayed by those who claim to protect them. But each day someone stepped forward. A woman who had been a nurse before the outbreak began treating injuries with the medical supplies Bruce recovered from the compound stockpile. A man who had worked in construction before the collapse started organizing teams to repair damaged sections of the stadium's outer structure. Children who had not spoken in weeks began making sounds again. Not laughter. Not yet. But something close. The precursor to laughter. The memory of what it felt like to be safe enough to make noise without consequence. John watched all of this from a distance. He did not participate in the rebuilding. He did not teach or organize or comfort. He sat on the upper level of the stadium with his weapons laid out before him, cleaned and counted and ready, and he watched the people below move through their fragile new routines with an expression that was impossible to read. Bruce found him there on the fourth evening. He sat beside him without speaking for a long time. Below them, a group of survivors had lit a small fire in the center of the stadium floor and were sitting around it, not for warmth but for company. Someone was telling a story. The words were inaudible from the upper level, but the rhythm was unmistakable. Rise and fall, tension and release. The ancient human pattern of narrative that predated every civilization and would outlast them all. John watched the fire. His hands were still. His breathing was even. And for the first time since Bruce had known him, there was something behind his eyes that was not calculation or threat assessment or the cold machinery of survival. It was faint. Buried beneath years of violence and loss and the systematic dismantling of everything he had ever allowed himself to care about. But it was there. Recognition. Not of danger. Not of a target. But of something he had once known in a life so distant it felt like someone else's memory. A home. A voice that made the silence feel chosen rather than imposed. He had buried that memory so deep that he believed it was gone. But watching those survivors sit around a fire in the ruins of a dead world, choosing to be together, choosing to speak and listen and exist in each other's company, something stirred. He did not name it. He would not have known what to call it even if he tried. But Bruce saw it. And Bruce, who had spent his entire life studying the darkness in people, recognized the light the moment it appeared. He said nothing. Some things do not survive being spoken aloud. He simply sat there beside a man who had forgotten what hope felt like and let the fire do what fire has always done. Remind us that warmth exists. They left on a morning that smelled like rain. The sky hung low and gray over the city, pressing down on the rooftops like a hand trying to hold the world still. Bruce had packed his gear the night before. His belt was restocked. His map was updated with new routes, new dangers, and new possibilities marked in careful lines. John carried what he always carried. His weapon, his silence, and the quiet certainty that whatever lay ahead, he would meet it the same way he had met everything else. The survivors gathered near the western gate to watch them go. No one asked them to stay. They understood, perhaps instinctively, that these two men were not settlers. They were not builders. They were something else entirely. Something the old world might have called heroes and the new world had no word for yet. A young girl, no older than 8, walked up to John before he reached the gate. She held out a small object, a wooden figure, crudely carved, shaped like a man holding a weapon. She did not speak. She simply held it out with both hands and looked up at him with eyes that carried no fear. John stared down at her for a moment that seemed to stretch beyond the boundaries of time. Then he knelt, accepted the figure, and placed it in his jacket without a word. When he stood, the girl was smiling. It was the first smile anyone in the compound had seen from a child since the world ended. Bruce and John passed through the gate and into the open streets. The walkers still roam. The distant groaning still filled the air like a hymn sung by a congregation that did not know it was dead. The world had not changed. The infection still spread. The dead still walked. Human cruelty still festered in every shadow where desperate people gathered in power went unchecked. But something had shifted. Small and fragile and improbable but real. Behind them a community had begun to breathe again. People who had been treated as property were learning to see themselves as citizens of something new. Not a nation, not a government, but a covenant. An agreement between survivors that the measure of humanity was not strength or violence, but the willingness to protect those who could not protect themselves. And when those survivors spoke of the two men who had freed them, they did not use names. Names belonged to the old world. Instead, they used descriptions that, over time, became something more. Became legends. Became myths whispered around fires in the dark. They spoke of a shadow who moved without sound and fought without killing. A guardian who believed that justice did not end simply because the courts had fallen. And they spoke of a ghost who moved without hesitation and fought without mercy. A warrior who proved that even a man with nothing left to lose could still choose to fight for others. One was the blade, the other was the shield. And together in a world that had already died, they reminded the living of something that no plague, no monster, and no amount of darkness could ever truly destroy. That humanity, even at the edge of extinction, is still worth fighting for.